Faced with large-scale protests and a dire economy, cities around America are defunding their police services. Everywhere from Baltimore to Seattle to Portland are considering large cuts or have passed large cuts in the recent weeks and months since the protests started after the death of George Floyd. Many would argue these cuts are improving policing by forcing cities to rely on non-police alternatives to tackle crime. But in this episode, we will call into question that premise. It seems like so much has happened in the past few months, it can be almost surprising that police reform was so much of what touched off the current political moments. In the cultural sphere, that where we can kind of forget that that's where this all kind of started. We got from that to like talking about television shows and so on and so forth. But that police reform conversation is obviously still very relevant and very important. Leighton, I know that you've written about how some of these reforms played out in the past, because obviously this issue did not start yesterday. And I believe that was in Los Angeles, right? How did that go? What happened there?
Yeah, I wrote a piece. This is back in 2015. It was a piece in Gawker. And I was looking at this experimental unit of the LAPD called the Community Safety Partnership Program, which at the time was a unit of about just 50 cops. They were tasked to the three most violent projects in LA, the three projects that were traditionally sort of the headquarters for the most violent gangs in LA. So this is Jordan Downs, Nickerson Gardens, and Imperial Courts in South LA. And this is where, the 90s war between the Bloods and the Crips were kind of staged out of these projects. So very violent areas. This unit was able to over the course of, crime rates were dropping nationally, but in these communities, they were able to cut homicide rates down by 70% and violent crimes in general by 50%. These are just remarkable numbers. And the way they did it was, and by the way, this came out of a very, extremely an infamous history of conflict between this community and the LAPD, starting in 1965 in the Watts riots, and then, of course, the 1992 riots, and then the Rampart scandal, and there was a DOJ consent decree over the LAPD, this long, turbulent history. And basically, the way that this unit was able to accomplish what it did was by, the sort of requisite political pressures came to bear to open up an opportunity for for meetings between the police and the community, very raw conversations. It became structured in a format called the Watts Gang Task Force, and these conversations opened up the space for as the name would suggest, community safety partnership, a partnership between the community and the police, which involved ex-gang members, just regular residents of those projects, including ex-gang members, gang intervention workers who were themselves former Crips and Bloods, and the LAPD and local politicians. And this involved old school community policing, lots of foot patrols, lots of getting to know residents by their first names, lots of things like backpack giveaways and reading to kids and things like that. All the stuff that people nowadays say has failed everywhere, these police reform pipe dreams that have flopped nationally. Well, at least in this one neighborhood in LA, it was an extremely successful case. And so this is what kind of perplexes me about this whole debate right now is this idea of defunding the police. The CSP cops are the highest paid. At the time I reported, at least, they were among the highest paid police officers in the LAPD. That was by design. They wanted them to have salaries that were high enough to be able to recruit the best folks within the force. They were all given promotions as soon as they became part of this unit. It's disproportionately female. But all these things, and they were trained, they had more invested in training than most of the rest of the force. All these things cost money. So, it's just like, to me, the defund argument is almost on par with saying, public schools are broken. We need to fix them by cutting their budgets. It's like the things that you need to do in order to make policing effective usually cost money, better training, better officers, competing for the best officers in a national talent pool. More cops, so that you have cops on foot patrols who are able to actually get to know the neighborhood instead of just one cop for 20,000 people rolling by in a car twice a day.
Right. I think one thing we should do, though, to be fair, is we should steelman the argument on defund the police, because
Sure.
to a large extent, I think people who are advocating for this are not saying we're just going to simply cut policing budgets. They're saying we're going to take that same amount of money and we're going to put it into various other services that would lead to crime amelioration. Is that more feasible, you think, than just cutting the police budget? Like, how would that play out in a situation like the one you described?
Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. And to me, sometimes this comes down to this sort of arbitrary budgeting issue where, like, if you're taking money out of a police department and you're putting it to, I don't know, Health and Human Services, then you're cutting the police department. Whereas if you keep it in the police department, but you have social workers who are on the police payroll, then you're increasing the budget. It's like, who cares, right? As long as the work is getting done. Within the CSP and LAPD, they were doing a lot of exactly the kind of work that the defund folks are calling for, which you had cops tutoring students, doing sort of Big Brother style type and Big Sister style type, like, mentorship programs. A lot of, like, social work was part of these cops' details. And so if that's done within the police department, I think that's probably a better. If you have cops who are doing that kind of work with the community, then you build not only trust in the police on the part of the residents of the community, but trust and understanding of a lack of fear of the community on the part of the police. It transforms folks on both sides. So I think it's actually better when it's done within the force. But that said, like, I could be persuaded that that a program where you have social workers in another department taking care of, like, homeless issues, truancy, things like that. Absolutely. I don't think you need armed cops to go in and do that stuff. Those details I find to be kind of distractions from the real issue, which is, how do you reform a police department? How do you build trust between the community and the cops? And for all those things, I don't see why you would start out by saying, with some arbitrary rule that whatever the solution is, it has to end up reducing the budget of the police department. It's like, who cares? As long as it works.
Yeah, and that's because the two things come to mind when we talk about defunding the police. One is that I think there's this perception that police suck up tons and tons of resources, and maybe we see imagery of, for instance, them having military equipment and things like that. Although that's largely given to them for free. It doesn't come out of the municipal budget because the Department of Defense just gives it away in the 1033 program, which is something I reported on back in 2014. But actually, in most big cities, the police budget is not, the education budget is typically much, much larger than the policing budget in the typical, like, American big city. And even in some of the more well-funded police departments, like New York City Police Department, is like, I think New York City has one of the highest, like, per capita, like, rates of, like, police. Like, it has a lot of police. Even in that city, the homelessness budget, I believe, is something like 1/2 of the policing budget, meaning that if you added up all the social services in New York City, they're much, much larger than the police department. Meaning that if you cut the police department by 10 or 15% or something and give it to social services, it's really not that much money. And at the same time, we're talking about New York City, which has the financial capital of America. You could argue one of the financial capitals of the world. Lower Manhattan. It has so much wealth. It has so much property right now where people have just, like, walked away from it and are living in McMansions in Westchester County or somewhere else in the state. It has so much wealth, and we're talking about taking. It kind of sounds like we're talking about taking a fairly small amount of money and shifting around between different hands. All of which I think could be useful. I think homelessness services can be very useful. Education can be very useful. Child and family services is very useful. And policing can be very useful. But it seems to me like all of these services don't have that much money to begin with. So we're not really talking about introducing that bigger pot of money that can really make a difference in a lot of these cases. Yeah. Now, it may be different case-by-case basis. There may be some small town that spends a ridiculous amount of money on, like, I don't know, police helicopters or something. I grant that those cases may exist, but it's probably something you have to look at on each individual case and make decisions, like, through your line items in the budget, rather than assuming that police are sitting on this giant, like, Scrooge McDuck, like, vault of
there's
gold coins.
Obviously a huge amount of waste in American policing, and I would say that that goes towards, not just like the military grade weaponry, which, as you say, a lot of that stuff is donated by the federal government and the military, but also, in training, in these sort of rip and run, warrior style search and destroy policing, all this stuff that is proven not to work, and the stuff that invites police brutality more than any other kind of policing. Maybe somebody has, but if they haven't, somebody should tabulate how much money is wasted on that kind of policing. That money should absolutely be diverted into better policing and or social services. The LAPD in the 90s was a shining example of the worst kind of policing in America. And it was very much this sort of warrior style policing where the cops saw the neighborhoods that they patrolled as their enemies. And they literally, not only were they seen as an occupying force, they saw themselves as an occupying force. The amount of money that goes into that kind of bullshit is probably, it must be vast. And so I don't know what it is, but I imagine that it is, it envelops huge portions of police budgets. That money is wasteful and it should be spent in different ways. But this idea that like an austerity program, is what will improve policing just seems like a strange argument to be coming from the left.
Well, it's interesting if you look. So there's two statistics that are really interesting, and I believe one came from Marginal Revolution, which is like this Tyler Cowen blog, where he compared American spending on policing and prisons to like Western European industrialized countries. And he found that America is actually much more tilted towards prisons than policing in terms of the way that we spend our criminal justice dollars. In fact, we don't really spend that much overall on police compared to a lot of our industrialized peers. We spend a lot more on prisons because we have a lot more people in jail. I think it's something like 0.7% of people are behind bars at any point in America. Like almost 1 out of every 100 people are in jail. So like we spend a lot more in prisons, probably more than police. But the second point I want to add to that is that like if you look up like the average amount that like Norway, which is considered to have one of the most humane prison systems, policing systems in the world, if you look at how much they spend like per prisoner, they actually spend 3 times as much per prisoner as America. Because you kind of have to spend a lot of money on something like a prison to make it a humane place, to make it a place where people can feel like they're learning like actual like tangible skills. I've done some work with former prisoners in the past and volunteering. And it's remarkable to me how little they actually get in prison in terms of education or skills. In the 1990s, they even banned Pell Grants for prisoners, so like it's hard for them to get like a college education or something. They have to pay for it out of pocket or through their family, which is not an easy process. So you kind of get what you pay for in a lot of these cases. Now, it should be noted that Norway overall spends a lot less money on criminal justice than America, even though they're spending more per capita. Because, again, you get what you pay for. If you're spending a lot of money on the front end to make sure your prisoners can come out better than they came in, then you're not going to have very high recidivism rates. I think Norway also has one of the lowest recidivism rates of any country, even within Europe itself. So sometimes it does take an investment on the front end to improve a public service. Simply defunding it across the board is not, obviously you can look at waste. That applies to every service, by the way. There are wasteful, stupid things that schools spend money on, too. Like, it doesn't mean we should cut the overall schools budget. Like, there's still plenty to be spent on. And that every single government agency is that way. I think like every major city in particular has some waste.
I'm much more sympathetic to the abolish prison argument than the abolish police argument. I mean, prisons have been, America, of course, just gave up on rehabilitation a long time ago. But prisons now are barely even for the purpose of retribution. They're now for the purpose of just warehousing populations that we don't know what else to do with, or we don't have the political will to do something better with. These are folks who are born into broken families who are then put into group homes and foster homes, who then go to public schools, which are more or less also just warehouses for kids who who society does not expect to ever be anything more than at best some lowly service sector worker and at worst a criminal. And then they go from there in and out of prison and basically are wards of the state their entire lives. These are just disposable populations of people, and that's what that's why the prison population, in my opinion, has mushroomed. It's basically just I don't want to sound like doctrinaire Marxist, but this is like a surplus labor population. What do you do with it? Stick them in prisons.
Well, I think that point is especially well made if you look at the history of a specific prisoner. So a lot of prisoners that you will follow, they come in and out, right? Like they are from kind of a rough background, family background, social background. They end up in prison. They leave. The average prison sentence in America is like 2.5 something years, something like that. But then they're back there in like 4 or 5 months again because they don't really have any skills. They don't really have any opportunities. They have kind of a bad social network. Like they just happen to fall in with people who are committing crime again. It's like a washing machine or something. It goes round and round. I think in more effective cases, like I think I looked up the Norwegian recidivism rate and it was like 20% or lower, like that. I think in those cases, a lot of people are coming out of prison where they feel like they went through school or something, like a good school. Like they, like, look, now I can be a chef, or like now I can be a teacher, or now I can be a carpenter. Like they feel like they actually did something meaningful there. And if you look at so many of our prisons, like I did some reporting about Alabama once, and their criminal justice reforms. They made a lot of progress, actually. They had a lot of success in terms of getting less people into jail. Through just basically lowering the penalties for a whole bunch of like low-level nonviolent crimes, so on and so forth. But they had so much overcrowding in their prisons that even when I think they have like the lowest prison population they've had in many years in Alabama right now, like thousands of people fewer. They're actually not saving any money, even after letting thousands of people just basically out of prison, because the jails are so overcrowded that if you spend less money on them, it would be like a massive human rights violation. Like, they take the money and they use it on the people who are still there because they're so, like, they're all over 100% capacity. Like, they actually have a capacity, like, number that they've made for the prison. They're all over, like, 100% capacity already. So, like, they use the money they have to try to make the prison a little bit better for the people who are still there, but they're so packed full of people. And that's something that's really missing in a lot of this, in that I think to make the left-right coalition on criminal justice reform, we keep having to stress that we're going to save money. Because, the right's very interested in that, obviously, and to some extent, the left has taxpayers and people who live in the suburbs with big houses and they don't like paying taxes either. And I think in the long run that's true. We would save money the same way like Norway spends overall less money than we do. But on the front end, it could take a real investment in a lot of these systems to like make them actually function or work, both on the policing side and on the prison side. And I think people are very averse to do that. They think we can do the entire thing just by like changing the penalties, electing softer prosecutors, so on and so forth. But really, you have to like repair somebody. Like it takes a lot of work. Like it's not like an overnight thing to make somebody into a person who's healthy, who's confident, who has skills, who's educated. Like it's a ton of work and it's a ton of investment. And I feel like that just hasn't really happened. Even though we've done a lot of other really positive criminal justice reforms, like we're paring back the war on drugs, we're lessening or eliminating sentences for a lot of low-level crimes, we're not doing the much harder work of actually taking people who are in and out of the criminal justice system and just can't get on their feet to actually get on their feet. And that to me is why I don't like the austerity discussion, because yes, there is waste to some of these systems, and for that reason, there are times where you should cut, but we actually need to invest a lot more, just like in the anecdote you told about what LA did with its police units.
Yeah. I'm a middle-class guy, and I don't love paying my taxes, but I guess at the end of the day, I am sort of a big government liberal in that respect that, look, you get what you pay for. And I think it's the same with the police as with any other institution, any other public institution. We need to invest in our schools. We need to invest in social services. We need to invest in the welfare safety net. And we need to invest in police to make police better. What happens when you cut funding for police? One case in point is the Albuquerque Police Department. I don't know what the budget is of the Albuquerque Police Department, but Albuquerque is not a rich city. The police department has one of the worst police brutality histories in the country. And there was a point in time when they were having a lot of trouble. And now, again, I can't say that this was directly related to budget troubles or some other sort of trouble, but they were having a lot of problems hiring new officers. city council had mandated that they hire new officers, and they weren't able to get them nationally. They had like a huge billboard. This was reported in the New Yorker. They had like a huge billboard up in I think on Broadway, Lafayette, in Manhattan, trying to recruit New York police to come to New Mexico. And because they couldn't, and they were under pressure to hire more cops, they ended up hiring all these rejects from other departments, people with disciplinary records, people with, people who the only people who they were able to attract to the job were the worst cops, and police brutality soared. Similarly in LA, in cities where you have a strapped, outgunned, understaffed police department, you have very scared cops going through communities in which they don't feel like they have backup from the department because there are fewer cops to go around, and they respond by puffing their chests up and becoming much more violent in order to terrorize the neighborhood into submission because they're scared.
Well, what's really interesting is, so you mentioned New Mexico. I believe one of the highest rates of police killings in the United States is in New Mexico, but it's in a different city. It's in Las Cruces, which is in the south, the part towards Texas.
A New Mexico police officer is being brought up on manslaughter charges for putting a suspect in a deadly chokehold.
I've been there. Actually, it's a beautiful city, wonderful people, but it's very poor. New Mexico is like one of the poorest states, like very few jobs, very little opportunity. I just looked this up on governing.com, keeps a good database of this. So Las Cruces has 17.8 police officers per 10,000 people. It's I guess that's their per capita kind of rating. New York City has 42, right? So you think about this. New York City, by the way, also has one of the lowest rates of police shootings of any major city now. Through a series of reforms, through a series of different things like dropping crime, New York City has one of the more professional police departments. We hear a lot about abuses there because all the media is there, and it's a huge city, so there's always going to be some abuses. But New York, more or less, I think, particularly going through de Blasio, was known as one of the more progressive police departments in America. But New York has, more than twice as many officers per capita as a place like Las Cruces, and Las Cruces has the highest rate of police-involved shootings in the entire country. I'm pretty sure of cities that size. And I do think there probably is a relationship between that. I think if you're dispatched as a lone officer into a dangerous situation and you feel scared, you're probably more likely to use your gun than if you know you're going to have a lot of support from other police officers. And by the way, it's not just other police officers. There was a situation, there's actually a state, Oregon, that has a program called Cahoots. And what Cahoots does is it has local social services and mental health professionals work with police in responding to cases. So it's not really an either-or situation where you don't need police at all in this scenario. The thing is, you have a value add by having the people who are trained in mental health working with the police, sometimes being dispatched simultaneously with police to situations. And I think that with more funding for both sets of services, I think you could actually build that relationship. And I think to some extent New York has done that as well. But I think if you're a place like Las Cruces, even if you just drive around Las Cruces, you'll kind of see this. You can tell it's not a place that's going to have a sophisticated mental health department full of psychiatrists and social workers who can deploy with police on a moment's notice in potentially dangerous situations. If they only have a pile of money for one thing, they're going to give it to the cops because you're always going to have someone going around with guns and shooting people. So the average city councilor and voters are going to be okay, we need to have the cops. And if all you have is the cops and there aren't that many of them and they have guns, it kind of turns into the every problem you see is a nail because all you have is hammers.
Right.
And honestly, I think that if you look another good example, honestly, is Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. has, I think, either the highest or one of the highest officers per capita, at least particularly for a city of that size. And I think over the past few decades, D.C.'s police department has very rapidly modernized. And I think we have very few complaints in the D.C. area in terms of police abuse. It doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But I just think it's considered a very professional department that has a lot of resources at hand. So they don't always have to reach for the gun, or they don't have to send one person who feels scared, surrounded by 10 people or in a mental health emergency. They actually have the resources to tackle these problems effectively. And I think it doesn't mean that resources are never wasted, and it doesn't mean I think we should throw money at every policing problem. But I think it is telling when some of the worst cases of violence and abuse do happen to be in some of these poorest places that really don't have the resources to set up a comprehensive kind of battery of services that they can use to reply to emergencies, when they really only have the one tool of the police, because that's kind of the bare minimum of what a city is going to have. Otherwise, I guess it's kind of the Wild West.
Yeah, and typically if you go into these communities, attend a local community meeting with their counselor, what you find is people who are not asking for fewer police officers, because there are obviously, it used to be obvious, I guess it's not so obvious these days, but obviously there are consequences to having fewer cops in the form of a higher crime rate, which gets utterly ignored by this defund argument. The folks in these communities tend not to want fewer cops. What they want are more cops who are better cops, who are not racist cops. Like that, it doesn't seem like too much to ask. Basically, they want what the suburbs already have, right? Cops who are officer friendly, who responds to a 911 call within 5 to 10 minutes, who gets there and treats people fairly and with dignity and respect, takes people seriously, and takes their victimization by criminals seriously. Not racist, doesn't abuse people.
Well, it's interesting. So you mentioned that, like, what people want, and I think you see that within survey work. Like, people generally tell people in high crime areas generally will say like one of two things or both things, which is that one, they do feel like they're sometimes profiled by police, or then people make assumptions about them just because they live in a high crime area, including racial assumptions, and also you could say gender assumptions, since almost exclusively men are kind of the people who are stopped by police. But I think there's also another thing they say, which is that sometimes they think police are not responsive enough to them. Like, I think Joe Lavoie's book Ghetto Side is largely about this, about how places can be under policed and over policed at the exact same time, because you'll have neighborhoods where people are just constantly getting ticketed for extremely low level crimes. It basically becomes a source of revenue. That's something that's been reported many times. But at the same time, if you have gunshots ring out, the police will take forever to get there. They're just not as responsive to that part of town. The news media will just kind of file it on page 7 of the paper, because they just think, oh, it's common, it's not news anymore. It barely
it's
gets
the
any
Ferguson
attention.
Police Department.
Yeah, I think that was certainly an example, although I think that effect probably is in many different places.
Yeah.
Was that you saw the exact same thing, which is the over-policing and the under-policing at the exact same time. And, it's interesting, in D.C., there was recently the case of a young boy who was killed. I believe he was 11 years old. He was on the way to a July 4th celebration. He wanted to stop by his aunt's house to pick up I think a charger for his phone or something, or a battery. As soon as he stepped out of the car, people were shooting. He was shot. His mother thought maybe he just ran for cover or something. That's why he was on the ground. But actually, he had been shot. He died shortly after. Of course, he was not involved in any of this. He didn't even know the people who shot him. This was just happened to be people have some kind of beef or grudge against each other. In America, we have so many guns. People often resolve their beefs that way. So his grandfather is John Ayala. He works for something called the Guardian Angels, which is a nonprofit of violence interrupters. They basically go around, and they're not really police, but they kind of work with the police.
They're the ones who wear the red berets.
Exactly.
Right.
And these were actually very common and popular in more high crime times, like in the 1990s. I think you see a lot of people like this. Now DC is nowhere near as violent as it was 20 years ago or further, but these people still exist, and he works with them. And they interviewed him, actually. They brought him on television, and they asked him, so what do you think about defunding the police? Some people in D.C., Black Lives Matter, saying we should do that. He was saying that he's all for spending more money on social services. I mean, given where he lives and the people he talks to, he knows how important that is. But he didn't want police services to be cut. He said the primary reason he didn't want them to be cut is because people have to be able to take the calls.
You need police to run those calls. We can't take money from the police department. We need the police. You take the police from there, and we wind up having less police officers in the street, less detectives. It's not going to work. The crime is going to get worse. But what I will say, we have to find money for the additional services that everybody would like to have. There are calls that come into the police department that should not go to the police. And certain calls should go to other agencies that can deal with maybe mental health.
He didn't want a situation where somebody's calling the police and they're taking just like forever to get there because they don't have people on the beat and they don't have people who can reply to the calls. And as someone who's worked with the Guardian Angels, has seen murder scene after murder scene, and it is very sad that he had to see his own grandson murdered this time. He just feels very, very strongly about that, and he's not an apologist for police abuse, and he's not someone who's against funding social services, but he just doesn't think that it would lead to anything good simply to cut police funding within Washington, D.C. But I think that's part of what happens when a slogan becomes kind of like a national meme. It's like everyone has to do this. Like Seattle's talking about doing this. I'm not aware of like Seattle's, like Peter Moskowitz he's a really cool guy who studies this. He used to be a police officer in Baltimore. Now he's a criminologist. He's kind of liberal-leaning, reform-minded, but he's a little bit heterodox in terms of where the more radical activists are. He made a big spreadsheet of cities and their police departments. I looked at it, and Seattle was nowhere near the top. It doesn't have very high police population. It has a much smaller police population than many comparable cities. I don't really see why there are people in Seattle asking for a 50% cut to the police budget. It seems like they just kind of arbitrarily created that number. And it seems like they want to do it because they feel like it's a national movement or ideology saying to defund the police. I would rather take a look at every city individually, every municipality, every department individually, look at what the problems are, where the solutions are. And I think DC is a good example of that. I just don't think there's any strong demand within DC to do that. I don't think that when the counselors in DC and people in who represent the different wards are talking to each other that this has even come up as a demand. I think there are some activists doing it, but I think the primary reason they're asking for it is because there's a nationalized movement for that. So they assume that they should just be on board. But the solution is really different, a little bit different everywhere. And I just don't think it's going to catch on in DC, particularly because DC has seen an increase in shootings, as has New York City, Milwaukee, Atlanta even. Many different cities are seeing that right now, and I don't think that most people are going to get behind this in that kind of environment.